Okay, so we spent the vast majority of the chapter talking about skeletal muscle. Now, the reason we spend so much time talking about that is because we use it as sort of the prototype of muscle. Because within skeletal muscle, we have our two contractile proteins that are arranged in such a way to give this striped, repeating pattern that really yield our functional contractile unit called the sarcomere. Are these words sort of sounding familiar from last week? Well, we do that because when we then look at cardiac muscle, the muscle of your heart, in many ways it is similar to what we saw with our skeletal muscle. We're still going to have those two contractile proteins. Who can tell me my A contractile protein? Actin. Who can tell me my M contractile protein? Myosin. So we're still going to have actin and myosin arranged in this overlapping pattern to give us a striated muscle look. Now, the big difference between cardiac and skeletal muscle, amongst some other things, is skeletal muscle, is it voluntary or involuntary? Voluntary. Cardiac muscle is now going to be the opposite, involuntary. Your heart is going to beat until you die. Period. No nerves have to tell your heart to contract. It does it on its own. The only nerves going to your heart tell it to either speed up or tell it to slow down, but it doesn't tell it to beat. That's something built into the heart itself. So cardiac muscle, unlike skeletal, is involuntary. Man, those batteries are low. Striated means we have sarcomeres, that overlapping pattern of actin and myosin. And also, in contrast to skeletal muscle, which are these long cables, cardiac muscle is branched and interconnected, which allows the cells to be woven together in the three-dimensional shape we know as the heart. Because let's say our biceps, for instance, it just has to contract along essentially one plane, pulling it both our origin insertion to contract and flex our forearm. The heart, however, remember, is compressing that organ down into a smaller volume, which forces the blood inside out to the body. We'll talk a lot about the pumping of the heart as we get into chapter 8. But I want you to understand that these cardiac muscle cells, since they do in fact know to contract on their own without the assistance of a nerve, these cardiac muscle cells only have to be started. The electrical activity that starts muscles contracting only has to happen in one place. That's why you have a location of cells in your heart that's called the pacemaker, the sinoatrial node, but it's the pacemaker. And once those cells, we'll say electrify, we'll get in a little more detail later, but once they electrify, that electrical chemical signal spreads throughout all of our muscles because all of our cardiac muscle cells have these junctions between them called intercalated discs. And notice these intercalated discs have a special kind of junction within them. What is that junction that we see right there? Gap junctions. You know the little tunnels between cells that allows the cytoplasm of one cell to be continuous with the other. So what that confers on our heart is that all of our muscle cells are functionally and electrically connected so that the cells are going to beat together as one unit. And that's what makes the heart so incredibly successful at what it does, which is contracting into a smaller volume and pumping our blood. So in this illustration, we can see at the top sort of the woven, branching, interconnected nature of our cardiac muscle cells. And you see these squiggly lines? The squiggly dark lines right there? Those are our junctions between cardiac muscle cells. Have you ever done any woodworking enough to know what a dovetail joint is? Have you ever heard of a dovetail joint? You know, instead of putting two pieces of wood flat together, just the flat ends together and trying to glue them together, that's not going to be a very strong joint because you don't have a lot of surface area to be glued together. So if you make a dovetail joint, which basically has these little finger-like projections, and the other piece of wood has offset finger-like projections that go into the slots, and you glue that together, now you've got a lot more surface area for those boards to hang on to. And so those little tongue and grooves intercalate together upon themselves. Do you see how it's similar to what we're doing here? In the lower illustration, do you see how we have the fingers and the grooves that are joined together? And the little purple area that you see, those are our gap junctions that then electrically couple the cell on the right with the cell on the left. Now we're going to do a whole bunch more on heart when we get to chapter 8. So we're going to leave cardiac muscle just right there. And we're going to move on and talk about the third type of muscle, which is smooth muscle. And again, we're going to compare to skeletal muscle when we look at smooth. Since smooth muscle contracts, that means you've got to have those two contractile proteins, actin and myosin. But in smooth muscle, actin and myosin are arranged in a more three-dimensional pattern, so the cell's not contracting in one plane, but contracting three-dimensionally. And since those actin and myosin molecules aren't all lined up, you don't have a striped pattern. There are no striations in smooth muscle, hence the name smooth and not striped muscle. You see where we get that now? Excuse me. But don't make the mistake of thinking, since there are no sarcomeres, there must not be any actin and myosin, because that's what makes the striped pattern. Remember, you can't contract without actin and myosin. It's simply a different arrangement. That's one thing that trips up a lot of students. Just like a lot of my elementary biology courses, when we talk about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, bacteria versus animal cells. The difference is one has a nucleus and the other doesn't have a nucleus. One of my favorite questions in those classes is, do prokaryotic cells, which don't have a nucleus, do they contain DNA? And about a third of the class will say, no, it doesn't contain DNA. Well, you can't be living if you don't have DNA or RNA. The only difference is you don't have the nuclear membrane. Well, it's sort of the same thing here. Just because you have no sarcomeres doesn't mean you don't have the contractile proteins, because you're still muscle, you still have to contract. Now, I'm sort of beating that point hard, but it's a place where students have gotten tripped up in the past, and I want to make sure that you don't miss that. Now, our skeletal muscle cells were cables. Our cardiac muscle cells were branched cells. And our smooth muscle cells are said to be spindle-shaped. Now, does anyone have any idea what spindle shape means? This is a very old, it's like almost an old English term that we probably haven't done anything with this in a very long time. You almost have to go back to the old nursery rhymes. Rumpelstiltskin, or what was the other Disney princess that had the spinning wheel and pricked her finger on the spinning wheel? What she pricked her finger on was the spindle of the spinning wheel. And this spindle shape looks something like this. You know how as the wool or the fiber is being spun around the spindle, it's fat in the middle and tapered on each end? That's the spindle shape that we see in this illustration of our smooth muscle. Now, this is a smooth muscle at rest. In the middle illustration, this is what that smooth muscle is going to look like when it contracts. Now, notice all the little red spots in this diagram. That's where our myosin and actin are connected to the plasma membrane. That is all over the entire cell. And so when you're pulling on those two red spots, trying to shorten that distance in every single area on the surface of that cell, do you know how you go from something that looks like a football, use your imagination, now we're squeezing that down into the shape of a softball. And if you have these cells arranged in a circle, like a belt, then you can control the passage of food from one part of your digestive system to the next. That belt of smooth muscle is called a sphincter. You have a sphincter at the bottom of your esophagus so that the food in your stomach doesn't go backwards. It's called the lower esophageal sphincter. If that sphincter isn't working as well, you're going to get stomach acid coming up into your esophagus, and what are you going to notice? Acid reflux, but we have just sort of a classic term for that, heartburn. You ever heard of heartburn? You burp and it kind of burns in your throat, like, kind of throw up in the back of your throat sometimes. That's kind of like heartburn. And people rub their chest and they're like, oh man, I got heartburn. What does your stomach have anything to do with the heart? You ever wondered about that? Your heart is right here in your chest, right? Your esophagus is running right behind it. And so it's burning in that same location of your chest, but really the two, other than location, aren't related at all. You have another sphincter that controls the passage of food from your stomach to your small intestine. Another sphincter that controls the food going from your small intestine to your large intestine. Those are bands or belts of smooth muscle. You have smooth muscle in these little strips attached to some of your hair follicles. So that when you get scared or when you get cold, these smooth muscle involuntarily contract, and what do you get? What do you get when you get cold? Goosebumps. Because you're trying to make the hair stand up, and as this little bundle of smooth muscle pulls on the follicle, it makes the skin kind of pucker up, as well as make the hair stand up. So there are a lot of functions of smooth muscle, but no striations. And as far as how we control them, we had skeletal, which was voluntary. We had cardiac, which was involuntary. Now we have muscle that is moving food in your digestive system. We've got muscle that is going to control your goosebumps. It's going to control the diameter of your airway. Is that voluntary or involuntary? Involuntary. You don't think of those things. So far, skeletal muscle is our only voluntary muscle. Involuntary is going to be both cardiac and smooth. Now, we've talked about injuries in class. We've talked about tearing our ACLs. We've talked about breaking our bones. Well, now we've all had muscle injuries too, probably. And when we're sore, this is largely going to be from overworking your muscles. Your muscles aren't ready for that kind of activity and you go out too hard, too fast. You go into your anaerobic respiration period and you got so much lactate muscle. All those things can cause your soreness. Now, when you overexert yourself, you're going to tear and you're going to damage sarcomeres. You're going to pull apart some of those actin and myosin cross bridges, and that has to be repaired. That's part of your soreness. But then we've also got in this area of chemicals, that's also going to be your lactic acid that's produced, causing soreness in your muscle. And again, as we mentioned last time, that's one reason why you want to stretch after you work out while you're cooling down to try to squeeze some of that lactic acid and these other chemicals out of the muscle. Now, we can sort of deal with the soreness. We can stay in better shape, not overexert ourselves too much, too fast. I think that really starts becoming a problem when you get to be 30, in your 30s, because you think you're still 20, but your body's really not 20 anymore. That's when it usually happens. But muscular dystrophy is something that you're born with. This is a congenital disease. It's genetic. And so with muscular dystrophy, and the typical one of these is going to be Duchenne muscular dystrophy, what's going to happen is the muscle's going to break down, as the name implies. And so we're going to get too much calcium leaking into the muscle all the time. Remember, calcium causes contraction, so you're going to have inadvertent muscle spasms quite often. But what's going to happen is this is almost going to poison the muscle. Another example of how too much of a good thing is still too much. So the calcium itself is going to cause the muscle to begin to break down. And as these muscle cells die, you're not really producing new muscle cells at the same rate they're dying, and so that area of muscle is replaced with connective tissue, scar tissue, like your ligaments and tendons. Ligaments and tendons don't contract. So as you replace the muscle with this scar tissue, the muscle gets weaker and weaker and weaker over time. And you see this a lot in their skeletal muscles, in their legs, and in their arms. But guess where else we have skeletal muscle that's under, and we've already talked about it, skeletal muscle under involuntary control. What's that muscle for breathing? The diaphragm. Well, that skeletal muscle begins to fail. And because that muscle begins to fail, our breathing is going to be much more labored. That's going to affect our blood pressure and all of that, because your body is working all together. That's going to cause your heart to go into a process that's called congestive heart failure. Your heart is going to have to work so hard, and it's not going to be able to keep up. You're not going to have enough oxygen, so the heart thinks, okay, we don't have as much oxygen in the blood, so we've got to pump more blood. Before long, the heart wears itself out. Because your lungs are already compromised because of what the diaphragm's doing, fluid begins to build up in your lungs. That's the congestive part of congestive heart failure. You literally drown in your own fluids. Do what? Your dad had that? Now, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. But someone with muscular dystrophy, it is rare that they live past 30 years. And your quality of life for those 30 years is not going to be very good. And that's probably one of the worst. Unless you've had cramps, and at the time you're having the cramp, you think that's the end of the world right there. I remember in high school, 2-a-days. It was always the second day, not the day after. It was the second day after. I woke up and I stretched. And I got cramps in both calves at the same time. I just rolled out of bed on the floor, screaming and yelling. My dad walks in. He thought that I was being attacked by a murder or something. I don't know. He said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I said, "Cramps." He just turned around and walked out. They're fixable, but they're no fun because they are painful, involuntary muscle contractions. And typically, why do your muscles cramp? What's that word right there? Dehydration. You've got to hydrate before and you've got to hydrate after. I see a lot of athletes walking around on campus with that gallon jug of water. I got bad news for our athletes. That's not enough for them. Gallon of water, what a normal person needs a day. Athletes, especially when it's starting to get hot, you need more. Because it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. I forget the actual amount. But it's something on the order of someone exerting themselves on a hot day outside, they can lose 10 gallons of water a day. It's crazy. You've got to stay hydrated. Now, the way that you work this out, because what's happening as you dehydrate, the electrolytes that remain in your blood, the potassium, the sodiums, the calciums, it's becoming more and more concentrated. And remember, those are how nerves signal the muscle, the changing of those ion concentrations across the membrane of our muscle cell. And it tricks the muscle into thinking it's getting the signal to contract. Well, the way to fix this is stretching and massaging. And if you look at athletes that get those cramps in their calves, have y'all seen the trainers get a hold of these people? They'll lay them on their back and get their leg, and they will push their toes down toward their body as they're keeping the leg straight. It's stretching out the calf muscle. And the trainer is massaging the calf to try to increase the circulation, to bring in more fluid, to try then to balance out the ions around that muscle that's cramping. And invariably, they're going to make you drink. And depending on your state of hydration, you may have to get an IV. which again is going to be the quickest way to get the fluid into your bloodstream to then get it to your muscle. But hopefully you can be hydrating plenty before we ever get to the point of the cramping.
So like when you wake up with a crick in your neck, is that an involuntary muscle contraction?
No, a crick in your neck is this weird thing. You sleep on it wrong. You somehow, and I think that's also maybe involved in pinching a nerve. So it's completely different from a cramp. A cramp is just totally unforgiving when you get a cramp. A crick is just a really annoying ache. And if somebody has a treatment or a remedy for a crick in the neck, let me know, because I will get those periodically and I'll have them for a week. And the massaging and the heat, nothing seems to work. They just kind of decide to come and they decide to leave whenever they want. All right, those are our three types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth.